Hey, Steve here, and this video is an introduction to adjustment layers in Photoshop. The first half of this video covers the basics of what adjustment layers are, the important difference between them and regular adjustments in Photoshop, how to use and add adjustment layers, and why they are critical in your non-destructive photo editing workflow. And then in the second half of the video, I'm going to walk you through some examples of how to use the most commonly used adjustment layers for Photoshop. Now, if you'd like me to cover some of the more advanced topics, then let me know in the comments what you'd like to see so I know what videos to make next. And if you're new to my channel and you like this video, then be sure to hit the like button and subscribe so that you don't miss any of my future Photoshop videos. And if you want to see how this all fits together into a cohesive landscape editing workflow in Photoshop, then be sure to download my free 6-stage workflow guide using the link in the description below. Right, so let's start at the very beginning with a quick overview of what adjustment layers actually are and how they are different to regular adjustments of the same name. So I've got an image open and it's just a single layer in the layers panel here, just a background layer. So this is what we're going to be working on in this demonstration. Now, the various adjustments that we can add to an image are found up here in the image adjustments menu. So we've got things like brightness, contrast, levels, curves, and they've got this full list here of adjustments that we can make. Now let's pick hue and saturation for this quick example. So let's say we want to change the saturation of the image. So we'd choose the hue saturation adjustment and we would simply move the saturation slider down to desaturate or move it up to saturate. Now let's say we want to saturate it, and I'm going to do quite an extreme example here just so that you can see what's happening on the screen. So we make that change and then we click OK. So that saturation adjustment has been baked into the pixels of the background layer. Now what happens if we decide that that was a little bit too much and we just want to go back and tone it down a little bit? So we still want to increase the saturation, but just not by so much. Well, using the regular adjustment, we can't do that. What we actually have to do is just undo the whole thing via the edit menu or Control or Command Z, undo it, and then go back in and redo it from scratch. Now, where adjustment layers differ is in that the adjustment is actually applied as a separate layer on top of the background. So we actually end up with two separate layers. So let me just show you that and we can kind of explain what it all means as we step through. So if we want to add a hue saturation adjustment layer, we go to Layer in the Layer menu and New Adjustment Layer, and then we'd pick that same hue saturation adjustment. Now, what's actually a bit quicker than going via the menu is if you have the Layers panel open, then you can just click this little icon down here in the bottom, and that will just bring up a quick menu with all of the available adjustment layers. So let's find that hue saturation adjustment layer again and add that. So instantly we can see that it's added a second layer to the image. And now this is why it's called an adjustment layer, because the adjustment is applied as a separate layer. And it's not baked into the pixels of the actual background layer. So let's make that same saturation adjustment using the adjustment layer this time and just really crank it up. Let's go too far, just like we did before. And now let's close the properties panel of the adjustment layer. And now, because this is a separate entity on top of the background, it's completely separate. If we want to go and adjust the settings of that adjustment, all we need to do is just double click on the adjustment layer itself in the layers panel. So if I do that, then it's going to reopen the properties panel and I can move the slider up and down, and we can see basically we can adjust the setting separately from the background. Nothing's changing in the background layer. No pixels are actually being edited or touched, and the ability that this gives us to go back and tweak various adjustments without affecting the actual pixels and the pixel-based layers within the image, that's what makes this a totally non-destructive type of edit in Photoshop. Now you can do all the same things, well, most of the same things, I shouldn't say all, but you can do many of the same things to an adjustment layer as you can with any other layer in terms of changing the opacity. So let's do this another way. So let's increase the saturation again. And let's close the properties. Now the opacity slider on the layers panel, that can affect the hue saturation or any adjustment layer just the same as it would any other layer. So we can reduce the opacity of the layer, the adjustment layer itself. Now we can reduce the opacity to sort of blend it in with the background. And also you've got these all these various blend modes which you can choose from. That's a topic for another video, and I'll probably create another video and link to that in this video at some point after I've made it, obviously. So if that video exists, it will pop up in the corner now. And you can also use any layer masking techniques that you like to use on an adjustment layer, just the same as you would with any other layer mask as well. So handily, when you add an adjustment layer, it already comes with a layer mask preloaded. So if we wanted to mask this adjustment out of a certain area of the image, then we can do that just by taking a black brush and brushing into the layer mask to remove that saturation effect from, wherever you want to mask it in and out from. And if layers and masking is a new idea to you, or if you want to sort of get started with it because you haven't used it before, then I've got another really in-depth video on how to get started with layers and masking, which I'll put in the video description below. But so far what we've done, we've covered really the main point of what an adjustment layer is and why it's beneficial to use over the regular type of adjustment. So what I'll do next is actually just run through real quick each of the adjustment layers that's available, just to give you a quick overview of how you can use each one for a particular task. I'll just give one quick example of the most useful ones, and if you want to see like a more in-depth video on each specific adjustment layer, then let me know in the comments which one you want to see most, and I'll create some separate videos for those in the future. And when I do, I'll link them back in the description to this video as well. So with that said, let's get rid of this adjustment layer here, this hue saturation. I can just drag that down onto the trash can icon down in the bottom corner to get rid of it. And yeah, let's just run through, like I said, each one of the most useful adjustment layers. There's a few down here that we won't go into because I personally have never found a very convincing use for them in landscape photography, which is what my channel kind of mostly covers. So starting at the top, technically solid color, these ones here, you've got the divider. These are technically fill layers. They're not technically adjustment layers, but they're in the same menu anyway, so we can cover them. Solid color, let's add one of those, and it pretty much does what it says on the tin. You can select a color in the color picker here, and it's just going to add a layer of that color. So you might be wondering why this would be useful, especially in landscape photography. Well, let's just pick a sort of a warm orangey color here and click OK. And we can see here we've got that color fill layer that's been applied on top of the background and separate to it as well, because as with any other layer, we can hide it and re-enable it. And also just a reminder as well, if we double click it, we can tweak the color if we want. So just a quick reminder there on what we can do. Now let's play with the opacity here. So let's move the opacity, let's slide it all the way down to maybe 5%. Okay, so it looks like it's kind of disappeared and it's not really doing anything anymore because it's on such a low opacity. But if I toggle this off and on again, you can see that warming effect is kind of really nice and subtle now because it's on such a low opacity. That's all you would need, and it actually acts like a nice warming filter. And if you wanted to as well, if you want to get fancy, you can put the opacity up a bit more, and then choose a separate blend mode, for example, soft light. And that also becomes another way to add a nice warm glow to your image. So the next one in this list is a gradient. Now I don't really find it that useful, to be honest, but I'll just show you how to add it. Maybe you could use this as like a kind of a faux kind of grad filter if you wanted, but anyway, I'll just show you how to use it and you can choose whether to use it or not. So let's say we wanted to make this a grad filter effect. What we do here is click within the gradient up in the top section, and that brings up the gradient editor. And if we just click to change the color here of this first point and make that black, and then click OK. There's, again, this is another probably another 20-minute video just to show how to use the gradient editor. I'll just show you the real quick version here. So I'm just creating basically a black to a transparent gradient. Click OK. And then what we can do here, because this is a linear gradient, you've got other types, but we'll stick with linear for now. You can change the angle of it so that it comes in from the top and goes down. And let's click OK to apply that black gradient to the image. And now to make this into like a grad filter kind of effect, we can maybe select multiply from the blend modes, reduce the opacity, and then you can see it's basically darkening the sky there. So I don't do this myself, but I figured it's something you can do and you can experiment with. So let's get rid of that. Let's move on to the next one. Pattern, actually I'm not going to show that. I don't think I've ever used it. So let's skip over that for now. Brightness and contrast, pretty self-explanatory. It just gives a brightness slider which you can move up and down to brighten the image or darken it. And also contrast, increase contrast or decrease. Again, pretty straightforward. But the benefit with it being an adjustment layer is that it's completely separate from the background or any other layers. So let's get rid of that and go to the next one. So that was brightness, contrast. Now levels and curves, these are where I do most of my contrast adjustments in my own workflow. I tend not to use brightness and contrast. Levels and curves is where it's at for me. So let me just show you how I would increase contrast in an image with the levels adjustment. Basically I would just, we've got these 3 points here on this histogram. To increase contrast in the highlights of an image, I just take this point and move it a bit to the right, and then take this one and move it a bit to the left. And when I toggle the layer off and on, we can see the contrast has increased there. And yeah, I have actually got some other videos in my on my channel that go into this in a bit more depth. And they will be linked in the description of this video, so you can go and check that out if you want to see some more stuff on levels adjustments for contrast. Curves is more commonly used for contrast, so you've probably seen the typical S curve that is usually the first thing that people learn how to do when using the curves adjustment. So to create an S curve, having added the adjustment layer, we can click on this diagonal line, click in the sort of the top third somewhere, and then drag that line up, and then click somewhere in the bottom third and drag that line down, and that creates this very soft S shape. So that's known as an S curve, and that, as you can see, has drastically increased the contrast in the image. And then you can mask that contrast in or out as you would with any other layer using the layer mask. But that's probably the most common use for the curves adjustment. There's also some color correction you can do with the curves adjustment. It's a really powerful adjustment. So yeah, definitely a bigger topic for a bigger video. Next, let's have a look. Exposure. Well, this is another one I don't really use that much, but if you just want to do a simple exposure adjustment, increase in stops here, so you got a +1. You can, to brighten the image, or you can darken it with -1. Offset and gamma correction. Again, don't worry about the terminology. You can, just experiment with the sliders and see if what they produce looks, looks any good. Personally, like I said, I don't really use this adjustment layer very often, so I'm not that familiar with good uses for these particular sliders. But yeah, I definitely encourage experimenting anyway, and make your own mind up as to whether you should use this one or not. Let's get rid of that. And okay, so now these ones in this gap here were all kind of relating to brightness, contrast, and whatnot. Next is kind of the color section of the adjustment layers. So vibrance, I'll just run through these really quick. Vibrance is pretty straightforward. Vibrance basically saturates the less saturated colors in the image. So this image is already quite highly saturated anyway, so it's not having that great an effect. You can see here we can go all the way to +76 on the vibrance, and the image doesn't look too oversaturated. But if I was to take the saturation slider and put that to the same value, it's going to look highly oversaturated. And that's because the saturation slider is saturating the image regardless of how saturated it is already, whereas vibrance is saturating the pixels that are the least saturated. So that's the difference between those two sliders. Okay, let's get rid of that and have a look at hue saturation. So yeah, saturation turns up in a couple of places, as do most things that you can do in Photoshop. There's always 1,000,001 ways to essentially achieve the same result. And again, this is a very complicated adjustment, and it can be very useful, but the the kind of the depth that we have to go into to show you how to get the best out of that, it's going to be a topic for another video all by itself. But essentially, the general gist of it is that you can saturate the image. So we've got this drop down here. When it says, the default is master. When master is selected and you adjust the saturation, it adjusts the whole image, just like the saturation slider on the previous adjustment layer. So you might be wondering why have the two. I guess vibrance, if they put vibrance in here, then you could get rid of the other one, because the saturation slider is doing the same thing, but this is just more powerful, because what you can do is choose a separate color to adjust. So rather than adjusting the whole image, we can say, let's saturate the yellows in the image. So we can select yellows, increase the saturation of only the yellows. And so we can see here that affects mostly the sky over there on the horizon. Or we can desaturate, or we can add lightness or remove lightness. And also, interestingly, you can actually shift the hue of the yellows in the image. So this can produce some interesting results. I would recommend experimenting with this to just sort of see what it does. I mean, it's if you're going to use this hue for a sort of a natural landscape kind of image, I would suggest very small adjustments just to really fine tune and tweak the hues of the individual colors. But yeah, spend some time with that and you'll see what I mean. If for example you just want to just very slightly change the yellowness of the yellows, then just go up or down by a very small number here. Don't take the yellow slider and then go all the way up here, and I mean that just looks weird, as you can see. Anyway, a topic for a separate video. All right, next, color balance. This this is an interesting one. It's one that I don't use that much, but I can see how many people can find it very useful. So the general gist of this is we select either the shadows, midtones, or highlights of the image, and then we let's go with the highlights for now, and then we can shift the colors of the highlights. So basically we've got the three colors, red, green and blue. These are the three color channels, and each one of these color channels has got an opposite color. So cyan, magenta and yellow. So yeah, let's say we want to take the reds in the highlights and make them more red. We can slide it up, or if we want to make them less red, we can slide it down, and vice versa. In the shadows, we can do the same thing. We can increase the reds in the shadows by doing that, or we can decrease the reds of the shadows doing this. Same with greens and blues and whatnot. And then midtones, same thing. Increase the midtone reds or decrease the midtone reds. And yeah, that's the general overview of how you use color balance. It's pretty cool. I don't use it that much, but I could see myself getting into it if I just spent the time. So let's move on. What was that? Color balance, black and white. This is another one that's pretty straightforward. So you add the adjustment layer, and it turns the image black and white. But where it sort of really comes into its own is each of these colors here. You can actually change the lightness of how each color appears in the finished, in the resulting image. So we can say, okay, in this image, in my black and white conversion, I want the reds to be really bright. So you can crank that slider up. I want the blues to be really dark, so you can crank that one down. And yeah, all the other colors in between, you can basically just tweak and adjust the brightness of each color within the image. Now, if you're not sure what particular color a certain area in your image is, then you can click this little fingery thing here, and that will give you an eyedropper, which when you then click somewhere on the image, it tells you, it highlights it over here in the panel itself, which color you're adjusting. So you can just move the mouse left and right in the image. I'm holding onto the mouse, by the way, and you can see which slider it's adjusting. So here, this is mostly red. I mean, most of this image is red because there's a strong red color cast in the image anyway. Up here, so this is the blues, so I can darken the blues. So yeah, this gives you the ability to kind of adjust the brightness of certain areas just by clicking on them. Just be aware that it's also going to adjust everywhere else that's the same color as where you're clicking. So there's another one to have a lot of fun with, and definitely one that deserves a much longer video than this. But again, this is just the overview. So let's move on to, okay, photo filter. This is very, very similar to, well, basically I think it's just the same exact thing as using a solid color layer, but it's just blending it in for you a little bit. So when we add the photo filter, the first thing that you're going to want to just have a look at is these drop downs. And so this is basically a bunch of presets. So a warming filter, a few warming filters, some cooling filters, red, orange, blah, 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 sepia, and basically all of these are just presets that are going to overlay a color. So in this case, it kind of shows us what color it's overlaying. So let's choose a cooling filter in this example, and it will change that to a blue. And then the density of that cooling filter, so we can increase the density of it to make it more blue, and reduce it to make it less blue. So yeah, that's something. I mean, if you want to get creative, I mean, yeah, there's a bunch of presets you can choose there. Or if you want a bit more control, then you can use the solid color layer, pick the exact color you want, pick the blend mode you want, and then the opacity, and you're basically getting the same thing. Now let's move on. So channel mixer, this is actually a really interesting and can be very useful adjustment layer. It's a bit of an advanced one though, so I'll probably skip it for this video, and yeah, I'll create a new video on that in the future at some point if there's enough interest. Color lookup, I wouldn't, yeah, not going to cover that. I don't use it in my Photoshop editing. So yeah, invert, posterize, yeah, all of these ones down here. I think well, maybe gradient map and selective color I'll show you, but these other three here, let's skip over those for now. They're not going to be coming up that often in your workflow. Actually, let's also skip over gradient map. That's probably a bit more of an advanced one, not in terms of what it does, but in terms of how to make it useful for landscape photos. Selective color though, that is a good one. Now this adjustment layer, similar to the channel mixer, you basically pick a color of pixel within the image that you want to adjust, and then you can basically just slide these sliders up and down. So sliding the cyan down is kind of the same as increasing the reds. So we're making the reds more red by reducing the cyan, or we can make them more bluey by increasing the cyan. And magenta, if we remove it, it's going to add green. If we go towards the right on the slider, then it's going to add magenta, and same with the yellows. So again, this is just another way to tweak the colors of particular colors. Where this also comes in useful is it gives you an option to adjust the whites, neutrals and blacks as well. So let's say we wanted to adjust the neutral colors and make the neutral colors more magenta, then we can do that. Kind of an equivalent of tweaking the midtones, highlights and shadows. If you like this video and you want to see more, then be sure to subscribe to my channel by hitting that round icon on the screen right now, and then get ready to watch the next video.